So hello and everybody who's joining us so far. My name is Amy Franco and I'm the Assistant Director of the Adult Department here at the Glen Ellyn Public Library, although I'm at home this evening. This program is offered Rebecca has really generously offered to donate her time and her experience and knowledge to us tonight, and we're super grateful. This is kind of a Q&A about the vaccine. We're going to take all your questions at the end. Our special guest tonight is biomedical engineering researcher Rebecca Keate. Rebecca is a PhD student at Northwestern, and as I mentioned, is generously volunteering her time and expertise to answer your questions about the vaccine. We're here to talk about the vaccine tonight, but I think there might be some questions about COVID as well, as we've kind of found some new updates of it. So Rebecca researches electrically conductive biomaterials for tissue engineering and holds a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology. Her research also includes bacterial infection, cellular mechanisms of cancer, and tissue mechanics. I'll be moderating this conversation with Rebecca and asking questions on your behalf. If you have a question for Rebecca, please type it into the chat. If you have any problems with Zoom, we recommend exiting the meeting and rejoining using the same link or meeting ID. If this is your first time using Zoom, you may need to adjust your settings and then restart Zoom in order to get the experience that you're expecting. If you still have issues after restarting Zoom, please type into the chat and I will assist you. So with that, I will welcome Rebecca with a warm welcome. It's just going to be me applauding tonight, but we're so grateful that you're here and that you are willing to talk to us about the vaccine.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. So as Amy mentioned during the introduction, today I'm going to be talking about since the vaccines come out, there's been a lot of talk about the end of the pandemic and what that looks like for everyone. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where we are in terms of restrictions by the state and what it looks like, the path moving forward looks like, and then I'll talk a lot more about the current vaccine landscape. So as Amy said, if you have any questions, please feel free to just pop them into the chat. So I want to start tonight by just introducing myself, in addition to the bio Amy already read. So I did graduate with a bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering from Georgia Tech, but I also have some industry experience because I did internships in research and design at Johnson & Johnson and Becton Dickinson. So I understand a little bit about how research works in an industrial setting and how that translates into the types of products that we see, like vaccines. So this is a slide that I showed back when I talked at the library last year. And what this shows is the different phases of Restore Illinois and how the state plans to reopen. So right now we're currently in phase 4, where gatherings of 50 or fewer people are allowed. We see a lot more businesses reopening. I'm sure a lot of you heard that the baseball parks are reopening, which is really cool. And we're still wearing face coverings and social distancing. But the question is, how do we move into phase 5, where things are even more normal than they seem now, and we're sort of back to the pre-pandemic lifestyle. So since last year, the state of Illinois has introduced this bridge phase, and that's sort of like phase 4.5, where it'll help us safely transition from the current stage we are now into the next phase. But the question, I guess, is how do we get there? And what does that look like? So in most cases, if you're interested in what these capacity limits will be formally for all the different types of settings, you can go to this link. And there's a whole list of the different capacity limits and the different restrictions in the different types of places. I just snipped these first 7 or so you can get an idea of how the capacity will change. So in general, it's mostly just an increase in the number of people that will be allowed in different places. You can see like amusement park right now, it's only 25% capacity. But then during the bridge phase, it'll go up to 60%. And that's just to make sure that we're not overwhelming and reopening too fast and causing increases in the spread of coronavirus before our systems are really ready. So in order to move there, there's a lot of metrics that have to be satisfied. So first off, 70% of residents 65 and older have to have received their first dose of the vaccine. And what's really interesting is we've actually already satisfied this for the state of Illinois, which is really great news that we're moving in the right direction and people are able to make vaccine appointments and actually get the dose. There also needs to be no increase in COVID-19 metrics and no increasing trends in hospital admissions and a certain percentage of ICU bed availability. Then, in order to move into phase 5, the biggest difference is 50% of residents 16 and older have to have received their first dose of the vaccine, as well as satisfying that none of the COVID metrics are increasing. And then just like we saw in the late fall and the winter last year, there's always the possibility that we might have to move backward into phases, and that's if any of these things happen, but hopefully that won't be the case. So where is the state of Illinois currently? Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of increasing trends in hospitalizations and daily cases compared to the past couple months. This could be caused for a lot of reasons, like the weather warming up. I think I was looking at the news the other day and they were saying it's a lot of cases in younger people. But so we had initially been scheduled to enter the bridge phase later this month, but I think for now that's going to be postponed with these increasing trends. So hopefully these aren't sustained for much longer, and then we can move into the bridge phase and looking forward into phase 5. So there also have been a lot of questions about like, what does the end of the pandemic look like? And really, in order to see like an end of any sorts, we have to have established herd immunity. And this was the initial predictions of when that herd immunity would be established. And you can see that it is a little bit later, the estimate of when we'll actually get that herd immunity from last fall. But so far it's anticipated that in the second half of this year, as vaccine rollout increases and more people are able to receive the vaccine, that will be possible. You can see down here all the factors listed that affect herd immunity. And the one thing that I want to point out is even though we have a vaccine and a lot of the population is being vaccinated, it's still important to social distance and wear your masks until herd immunity is established, because we want to prevent the development of variants of the virus. Because if variants start to develop, then the situation can become more complicated and potentially postpone the reopening of the bridge phase and phase 5. So that's something to keep in mind about why maintaining these good practices that we've developed over the past year for now is still important, even though I know it's easy to get like fatigued with the social distancing and wearing a mask, but the end is in sight. So it's good to maintain those practices. So that's just an introduction on where we are in terms of the spread and how the vaccine is actually lowering numbers and preventing hospitalizations. But I also want to talk about now, shifting gears, what vaccine development looks like, because I know there's been a lot of questions about how safe is the vaccine, and because the vaccine's been rolled out so quickly, how do we know that it's safe, and what types of controls is the FDA doing to make sure that the things we're receiving are safe? So before we start, I want to review the vaccine development process. So starting from nothing, going all the way to the time where a first patient receives it, there are a lot of different phases and a lot of work that goes into vaccine development. The first being actually being developed in the lab. And part of the reason that the coronavirus vaccine was able to be developed so quickly is because we used an mRNA vaccine. And I'll talk more about what that means later. But the important thing for now to know is that there was already some development on this type of vaccine before the pandemic even happened. It's been a long time that people have been studying how RNA vaccines work and how they can be effective. So that was a really good thing to kind of get us kickstarted. So after that, there's a lot of toxicology testing, and that can be done with cells or with animal models. And then there's a submission to the FDA to initially show that the formulation of the vaccine won't be toxic. And after the initial toxicology testing and proof that there might be some effectiveness in animal models, then you can start to move into clinical trials. And through clinical trials, there's phase 1 where you're looking at how safe is it and is there an immune response, and then phases 2 and 3 where you actually look at how well the vaccine works at what it's supposed to do. So in this case, how well does the vaccine actually protect people from coronavirus? And then lastly is manufacturing considerations, which in that there's also, with this vaccine, there's a lot of questions about what's the best way to plan in order to distribute the vaccine after it's manufactured, especially in a timely fashion, since these types of vaccines have to be stored at ultra cold temperatures, which can sometimes make things a little bit more difficult. So currently in the United States, we have 3 approved vaccines as of March 17th. And I also want to say that we've gotten all of this information that I've gotten today is accessible to you if you want to look into it more on your own. The Department of Public Health of Illinois website is a super great resource. It has a lot of very transparent and helpful information so that you can actually read on the safety of these things yourself. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is unique in that it only requires 1 dose, whereas the Mrna and the Pfizer require 2 separate doses, and it's also the most recent. So as I mentioned, distribution of these vaccines is a bit complicated because you can see they require ultra cold temperatures. The Pfizer needs to be stored at -60 to -80, which is not actually a super common type of freezer for all sorts of places. So that's one thing that makes it a little bit complicated. And then there's also different age requirements. So the Pfizer is approved for anyone 16 and older, whereas the Johnson & Johnson and the Mrna vaccines are only approved for people 18 and older. So why exactly is that? Why are there differences in these ages of the vaccines? That's because of how the clinical trials were designed. So as I mentioned, clinical trials are a super important part of the vaccine development, and there aren't super strict guidelines about how these clinical trials need to be designed. In general, in science, it's a super big ethical question about deciding what populations should be included or excluded from clinical trials. Because, the entire point of a clinical trial is to make sure that something is safe and something is effective. So in initial clinical trials, a lot of times populations like pregnant women and children under 18 can be excluded. So although a lot of the vaccines currently are only approved for people 16 or 18 and older, there are clinical trials that are separately being conducted now to make sure that the vaccine will be safe for the younger population. So you can go actually on clinicaltrials.gov. It's a NIH, which is the National Institute of Health. It's a database from that institution. And you can see all of the clinical trials that are registered with the government and what phase they are in. And then you can also read what the point of them is, what they're trying to look at, and why. So I just picked 2 here that I thought were important to recognize. The first being the clinical trial that's being conducted in children less than 12 years of age to make sure that it's safe for them. And the status here is not yet recruiting. So they haven't started accepting patients for this trial, but soon they will. And then the other is looking at the safety of the vaccine in pregnant women, which is another group that's typically excluded from clinical trials just because you're not exactly sure how it might affect people at first. But that doesn't mean that it's inherently not safe. It just means that there's a lot more work to do in order to analyze the safety in these populations. So I think I'll take a quick pause here and see if there are any other questions in the chat.
So just a reminder, if you do have a question, type it into the chat. I haven't seen anything come in just yet, but I know that some of the common questions that we get at the library about the vaccine are things like, how did we get here so quickly? I mean, it happened in under a year. And a lot of people are asking us things like, why don't we have a vaccine for some other common viruses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's a good segue into the next part of the presentation. So part of why the vaccine was developed so quickly is because of the actually the science. So this vaccine, as I mentioned, is an mRNA vaccine, whereas previously a lot of vaccines actually used the dead version of the virus. So how the vaccine works is the first part of why the vaccine was developed so quickly. And the coronavirus is unique, and part of the reason it is causes such severe illnesses in the patients that it affects is because of the spike proteins that are on the surface of the virus. So in this cartoon here, you can see it's annotated here. And the spike proteins are one of the things that our bodies struggle to fight off. So what the scientists who designed the vaccine leveraged is actually putting sequences in the RNA that will produce that spike protein. So what mRNA is basically the blueprint for our cells that tells them how to produce different proteins. So if our cells experience the RNA for this spike protein, they're going to attack it and know how to fight it. So that's what the vaccine is. It's a dose of the virus RNA that usually attacks the spike proteins, which means that when you get the vaccine, what you're becoming immune to is the virus, any coronavirus that has that specific sequence of RNA for the spike proteins. So usually vaccines contain inactivated or dead viruses, which can be a lot more complicated to produce. But in this case, the RNA is more effective in that it could be developed quicker. So that was part of the reason that works. So after receiving the RNA, it's wrapped in special coating, and this is proprietary, and I'm sure the type of RNA and the way it's actually packaged in the vaccine is different for each of the approved doses. And this is a really cool diagram that shows exactly what happens when the vaccine is injected into your body. So the way viruses actually infect us is they make our cells produce the proteins that they need to survive, and they use our cells as the machinery to sustain themselves. So that's why if we receive the RNA from the virus, then our body is able to produce antibodies in order to fight it. So I think this bubble here says it really well, that after the mRNA delivers the instructions, your cells now can have practice identifying this virus and fighting it off. And I think that's one of my favorite ways to look at the vaccine, as practice for your cells. So your cells need to understand exactly how they can fight off these proteins that are pretty lethal that the coronavirus produces in an easier setting than when it's a whole virus itself. So the vaccine itself doesn't actually contain any of the virus, and that's important to realize because sometimes with other vaccines, there's concerns about, if I get like the flu vaccine, am I able to transmit the flu to other people? And that's definitely not the case. If you receive the vaccine, it's not possible for you to, it's not giving you the coronavirus, and it's also not augmenting your DNA or anything. It's just giving your cells the blueprints to produce antibodies against the spike proteins. Like you can see here in this diagram, these purple antibodies are then able to fight the coronavirus because your body knows, your body recognizes the RNA that produces the spike proteins, and then it's better able to fight it. So that was one half of the reason that the vaccine was able to be developed very quickly. The other reason is because of differences in the way the FDA interacted with industry. So since March, since before March, since the coronavirus was first discovered in 2019, we knew that this was going to be a problem, and we knew that there was going to need to be a vaccine in a very urgent way. So the federal government regulates all these things very closely, and they wanted to make sure that we were safe when the vaccine did come out. So they actually produced this separate document here called Development and Licensure of Vaccines to Prevent COVID-19. And this is supposed to act as a direct handbook to the companies that are producing the vaccine. It's a pretty interesting document, and the link is here. If you're interested, you can take a look. And what this document does is it steps through each phase of the vaccine development that I mentioned earlier, and it tells companies exactly what the federal government is expecting to see at each phase. So part of the reason that vaccine development usually takes so long is because of getting this FDA approval. So the fact that the government was able to make this a priority and also make their expectations very, very clear for companies is part of the reason that this was able to be expedited, was the relationship between the people making sure that we're safe and the people that were developing the vaccine. So I highlighted here a couple of points that I thought were very impactful. First, looking at the right, that the FDA says in this document that they want to provide early advice and kind of be partners in the vaccine development. The plans for clinical trials and the plans for verifying toxicity and safety. And they also say that these companies should plan to submit summaries of data that are available at each milestone for the FDA to review and then say, okay, now you can move on to the next phase. This isn't necessarily how this process always works. So that's one reason that that this was able to be pushed out so quickly. And then if you look at safety considerations here, it outlines very clear guidelines for the companies to monitor people's safety. So it even lays out here specifically what it wants these companies to look for in its clinical trials where they use pregnant women. And it also mentions here that it wants all adverse events to be documented and to be very transparent. So I think that this document, for anyone who's not sure about what types of checks and balances were done to make sure the vaccine was safe is a very helpful tool, so that you can feel comfortable knowing that there was all these different verifications done in order to make sure that things were being done properly. There weren't any shortcuts taken, despite the fact that the turnaround time might suggest that. And that's because we were really prepared, and the government did a great job at making sure this vaccine was a priority. So I think we can pause here if there are any questions.
We do have a couple of really great questions. Adriana wants to know, how does the industry gain access to the inactive viruses so they can develop a vaccine of this type?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure like how the virus is sourced. There are biological companies that like specialize in the handling of these types of things. Like there are companies where you can purchase cells and you can purchase, deactivated viruses. So it's trained professionals that have the proper safety equipment, and that there's a pipeline for it. It's not like the samples are necessarily being taken from patients. And I think something that's also really important to recognize is that not only was developing this vaccine with the virus RNA a lot of work, but it was also a lot of work for different academic and industrial entities to actually figure out what that sequence of RNA that codes specifically for the proteins is. So over the past year and a half, there's been a lot of really important science that was done in order to get us this vaccine. So not only just how do we package the vaccine and how do we develop it in a way that's going to help people, but also which parts of the virus mRNA are the most important, how do we sequence this, what is the sequence, and which parts of the mRNA do what in terms of the virus function. So that's a really important question, and I think it points to a lot of the other science that has been done that supports the fact that the vaccine will work, even before we started receiving the vaccine.
That's so interesting. I don't know if you've ever read that book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah.
But
my list.
it's so good. And they talk about, I don't know if anybody in our audience has read it, but Henrietta Lacks was a woman who had a really invasive type of cancer. I think it was cervical cancer. And without her knowledge, her cells were taken and now are some of the most common cells, I guess, used in biomedical research.
Yeah,
and
number one.
Yeah, so the book really focuses on kind of the background, some of the ethical considerations, but it's, for that tiny part of, just asking where that comes from, there's some really interesting science in that book. And so I'd encourage everybody in our audience tonight to read it if you can. Couple of other questions. Maria would like to know, if the FDA provided guidelines back in 2019 and monitored the steps, why hasn't the FDA fully approved the vaccines yet?
I think the reason that they're not, because they're approved for emergency use authorization, I think there might be, I think there are still some populations that are in question. And also, I think the power of the clinical trials is a question. So when I say power, what I mean is the number of participants. Usually there's a lot more that are involved in clinical trials or that are required depending on the statistical analysis. So I think that there are still, as I showed on the clinical trial database, the little screenshot that I took, there's still a lot of clinical trials that are being performed. But I think that the emergency use authorization is the most important, and I do think it's safe. The other question is, because we pushed this out quickly, we could only look at, within 6 months to a year. So with the immune system, I don't think it's super concerning that there are negative long-term effects, but usually the government wants to follow people for longer periods of time. But usually I think it's not as much of a concern. So that's why these guidelines are, I think, still safe.
So would it be fair to say then that we just don't have enough information yet for a full FDA authorization?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Clinical trials, usually actually part of what takes so long in vaccine development is recruiting for clinical trials because you're looking for specific populations. In this case, I think that was also something that happened faster than it usually does. Usually clinical trial recruitment can take a year or 2 years by itself. But because there are so many people who were willing to get involved and help out with this one, that's also part of the reason where that it was able to be expedited.
And I have to just say that those people are really heroes. Those people who volunteered to get the vaccine before everybody else. I know everybody wants it so bad now, but I think, they had such a huge part in helping us get to where we are now. I just think it's really amazing.
Yeah.
The last question that came into the chat, and I don't know if maybe this leads into your next couple of slides, but Jay would like to know, what is the current information on whether fully immunized individuals can still carry or transmit the virus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I think is not super well known yet. And there are a lot of questions, like I said, still about the vaccine. Each company that performed a clinical trial looked at slightly different things in slightly different ways because there aren't very clear, strict standards on what a clinical trial looks like. So in terms of transmitting the vaccine, I think that's something that's difficult to measure. In a clinical trial, it's how do you say, oh, this person was vaccinated, but they gave the virus to 3 other people? That's not a metric that is easy to measure. But I think as time goes on and people continue to get vaccinated and then tested in order to determine if they are carriers, that's something that might clear up that question. And as the entire population gets vaccinated, it'll be easier to see those numbers decrease as a demonstration that, yeah, the vaccine actually does help stop the transmission of the virus. In terms of the clinical trial metrics, I think the most important things were looking at hospitalization and death numbers. And in that case, all 3 of the vaccines showed really, really great efficacy in preventing hospitalization and death. And that's why they ultimately were approved, because they're actually stopping people from getting so sick and overwhelming the hospitals.
So maybe that'll be something that we learn as we move closer to this full FDA authorization.
Yeah, I definitely think that's something that we'll know more about going forward, is how is someone who's vaccinated less likely to actually transmit the virus to other people.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all of our questions for now. Just want to remind everybody in our audience, continue to write your questions in. I'd be happy to ask them. But I'll hand it back over to you, Rebecca.
Awesome. So next I wanted to talk about how you all can get the vaccine and what the timeline looks like. So up until this point, the people who were eligible for the vaccine were essential workers and people over the age of 65, primarily in populations that had comorbidities that put them significantly at risk. Also, people who are in higher education or teachers have been able to get the vaccine recently, but effective on April 12th, as long as this date doesn't actually get pushed back, all populations will be eligible to sign up for the vaccine in Illinois. So this can be a little overwhelming in terms of like, how do I actually do this? There is a form that I've attached a link to here that you can actually use in order to sign up and fill in all your personal information, including your age, and it'll just check that you're eligible. And as of April 12th, everyone is. So that won't be anything to be concerned about. And then through this portal, you can make an appointment. You could also call the DuPage Health Department if you don't have access to internet or you don't want to fill out the form. That's fine too. And I believe that they can help set you up with an appointment. You could also, a lot of local pharmacy clinics like Walgreens, Mariano's, are performing appointments there. So you can look at their websites. There's also max vaccination sites. So there's quite a few in Cook County. In DuPage County, I think there's only 1 or 2. And then I think a lot of local clinics are letting you get vaccinated there, although I'm not sure how those appointments work. I think you have to go on a waiting list if you want to get it through the doctor's office. So if you are trying to find a place near you or what the closest place near you is to actually make this appointment, you can use this location finder that I attached the link to here. And it will show you all of the places near you that you can make an appointment. So you can see Walgreens, Jewel Osco, Mariano's are all places that you can receive a dose of the vaccine, and you can just make your appointment through their website. So it's more difficult, I think, right now because a lot of people want appointments, and I'm sure when April 12th comes around and everyone becomes eligible, there will be more people who want appointments than appointments available. But you can definitely monitor these websites, and when an appointment becomes available, you're able to sign up. And this location finder is super convenient because it will show you the place closest to you. Alternatively, you can use the portal that I put the link to here, and I believe that should show you how where there are available appointments. I actually got vaccinated last weekend, so I got my vaccine through Cook County because that's where Northwestern was, and they had a similar portal. And the way it worked for me is I just signed up with all my information, let them know I was eligible because I am a higher education staff member, and then it showed me all the different locations and the available appointment times. If you are looking for a specific manufacturer of the vaccine, so if you want to get the Pfizer versus the Mrna versus the Johnson & Johnson, the way I saw it on my portal is there were specific places that had Pfizer, and then there would be specific places that had Mrna or specific places that had the Johnson & Johnson one. So if you have that preference, or if someone is between 16 or 18 that you know and trying to get vaccinated, for example, they need to get the Pfizer one. In that case, then you have to make sure you're signing up for a site that offers the type of vaccine that you want. And I believe that they should be very transparent about that on the website or the form. So you can definitely just sign up for the type of vaccine that you are interested in receiving. So that was most of what I had prepared in terms of how you get the vaccine and the vaccine safety. There are a lot of really helpful resources that are available to you if you have any questions. First and foremost, you could talk to your doctor if you have any questions about the safety or how to actually get the vaccine. As I mentioned, the Illinois Department of Public Health has a lot of really great resources. So they have all of the coronavirus metrics very clearly lined out, like I showed earlier. If there's an increase or decrease or no significant change in hospital numbers for each of the regions in the whole state. And then also what the plans are for reopening. It's a really great resource to go on that website. If you have questions about actually getting the vaccine, and where it's available. The DuPage County of Public Health is also a great place for information. There's a couple of videos on their website where they clearly detail the process of how to sign up for the vaccine. And if you go to one of the mass vaccination centers, they will tell you what's expected from you and what you'll need to bring in order to have that happen, and just walk you through the whole process so that you're prepared. The CDC website is where I got all of the information on the mRNA vaccine, how exactly mRNA works and why it's helpful in preventing the virus. And then the NIH clinical trials database. That's very helpful in order to see what types of questions these companies are currently working on solving. So just on the ones that I showed today, the couple that I thought were the most interesting, you can see that they're looking at vaccine safety in children less than 12, and also making sure that there aren't any adverse effects in pregnant women. So that's very helpful. And then also different company websites. So Pfizer, I was looking at the website today, is very transparent on the clinical trials that they're running and what types of questions they're asking, and not only just for vaccines, but also for treatments. So pharmaceutical approaches to actually help people who might have the virus and be in severe conditions. And then also the library is a super helpful resource. And obviously somewhere you can go to if you have questions. I don't know if Amy, you want to say anything there about that?
I just want to remind everybody that we are here to answer your question. No question is too big or too small for us. And even if we don't know the answer, we'll try to help you find out where you can get information. I also want to let you know we had a pop-up vaccine clinic last week in Glen Ellen. Many of our seniors got their first dose of the Pfizer vaccine, and a lot of people have been asking us about the next pop-up clinic. And we are working on that. It's a much more complicated process than you might expect. It seems like you might just be able to order a batch of vaccine and then administer it, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes for that. We are working on it, but we get a lot of our information from the County Department of Public Health. So if you have not received the vaccine yet and you want to receive it and you want to get information from the library about any future pop-up clinics when you're eligible, please make sure that you are registered with the DuPage County Department of Public Health, and make sure that you're getting their emails. I think they send emails weekly or maybe twice a month. If you're getting those emails, then you're on the list. And if we can accommodate you for our next vaccine clinic, we will get the list from the county and we will try to help you find a vaccine appointment.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming today. And if anyone has any more questions, please pop them into the chat.
We do have a couple of questions. So Maria would like to know, I'm sorry, my cats are just monsters when I'm on a Zoom call. So Maria would like to know, the Pfizer vaccine and the Mrna vaccines were the first ones to come out, and those were the mRNA vaccines, but it's my understanding that Johnson & Johnson is a little bit different. So Maria is wondering if you can kind of explain the difference in the J&J vaccine versus the mRNA vaccines.
So I'm not exactly sure what the nuances are different. I thought that the Johnson & Johnson was also mRNA, but I guess I would have to.
You might be right. I'm
look into it.
I thought it was a little bit different, but I'm not a scientist.
It might be some things about the delivery that are different. I am not totally sure, but I think it is mRNA.
Okay. Adriana has a really great question, but I want to leave it to the end if we can. As we're talking about these three different vaccines, I just want to say for the record that I also received my vaccine. I've had my second dose. I got Mrna. I live in Cook County, and so I went to a Cook County mass vaccination site and had the exact same experience that Rebecca did. And if you haven't gotten your vaccine yet, I know it's really, really frustrating to try to find an appointment, but if you can just keep reloading the page at various times of the day and, try different websites. Hopefully it won't be too much longer until you get your vaccine. So as we're thinking about these 3 vaccines and, maybe having a choice between them, which one is the best?
Yeah, I think that there's no answer to that because the clinical trials are all different. It's like comparing apples to oranges in this case because I mean the statistics are different. Like, each one has different percentages, but in terms of like the sample size, like the number of people that were enrolled, the metrics that they looked at, how they looked at those metrics. And like, for example, Pfizer looked at a totally different population of people. They looked at people 16 and up, whereas the others looked at 18 and up. So if you are between the ages of 16 and 18, I think the Pfizer is definitely the best for you at this point. But I think that they all work or else they all wouldn't be approved. The Johnson & Johnson one might be the best for you if you can only get a single dose. Because so that's a little bit more convenient because you don't have to get the 2 doses. But I think other than that, you can't really judge too much.
Okay. From the public information standpoint, the thing that we've been telling people is the best vaccine is the one that you can get.
Yeah.
And we're trying to encourage people not to be picky about, if you do find a vaccine appointment, just take it, even if it's not the one that you think you want.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
So I know that we just got some information, I think earlier this week, about Pfizer's vaccine efficacy in younger teens. I think 12 to 17 is what they looked at. If you're looking into your crystal ball, do you have an idea of when the vaccine might be available for children, or is it just something that we're going to have to wait and see?
Yeah, it's the reason these things are tricky is because usually it's a big ethical question in general, what populations you include in clinical trials. When you start talking about pregnant women and children less than 12 or 13, it becomes like, are they deciding they want to be in the clinical trial, and like, do they understand the risk that they're taking? And we have administered enough of these vaccines that we're sure they're safe in adults. Obviously they're approved, but at the same time it is a risk to administer something in children because their bodies are different. And so the ethical question comes into like, do they understand that risk? And when they sign the waiver, or when their parents sign the waiver, it's just a big question of including those populations. So it is a good step that we're, taking it slow. I think it's good that Pfizer included 16 and older. And I think that's why we're kind of going stepwise. So to make sure that there's no serious adverse effects in early teens. And then we can start to think about younger children. But part of this is this whole process is understanding the risk versus the importance of prevention. So for older populations, they were obviously going to be not necessarily the first in the clinical trials, but they're going to be considered in the clinical trials because they're at the largest risk for COVID-19. With children, we're still not really sure what that risk is, and in terms of getting the virus, and we have to think about, is the risk of getting the virus more or less than the risk of getting a vaccine that might have effects that we didn't see coming. So I think that's why it's good to take it slow. In terms of like an estimated date for children, I don't think less than a year. I think maybe this time next year or at the end of 2021, it could be approved.
Got it. All right. So I have another question for your crystal ball that you're looking into.
Yeah.
We know that all adults are going to be eligible to get the vaccine beginning April 19th, which is just a couple weeks away. Do you have an idea of how long it's going to be until this frenzy dies down? For example, how long it's going to be until you can just like go to Walgreens like you can with your flu shot, or just like get it with your annual checkup or something like that with your doctor?
Yeah, this reminds me of testing. Um, Last year, when we first started, when the pandemic first happened, everyone who needed to get a test, that was like very difficult to access. But as more tests were produced and more places got capabilities, it became easier and easier to where now, if you need to get a test, it's not a big deal. And I think that's going to happen with the vaccine. So it's not just that there's a frenzy now and that it's going to stay that way, because as more people get vaccinated, less people are going to be looking for appointments. But in the same time, what's happening is these companies are ramping up production, and they're getting the distribution patterns down, and they're figuring out how to manufacture the vaccine effectively. So I think within a month, maybe the beginning of May, it should be pretty easy to get an appointment, but I could be wrong.
It's an interesting thought, and it's funny to think back of when you did, your previous presentations for our library, and we were talking about, how difficult it was to get, testing appointment, and now you can pretty much just get it. When I drive to work, I see like a drive-through clinic that never really has anybody in line. So it's not like you've got to line up at the county complex at 5 o'clock in the morning in order to get your testing appointment. And so it's maybe hopeful that we will get there soon with the vaccine as well. So can you tell us a little bit about side effects and why some people get them and some people don't? I know I had a sore arm when I had my first shot, and when I had my second shot, I was like down for the count for 2 days. But some of my friends have not had such strong side effects. So what's the deal with side effects?
Yeah, so for sure you're gonna have a sore arm. I think every single person that I've talked to has had a sore arm, but really it's a difference in how your immune system responds. So when you get sick, the actual sickness isn't from the virus, it's from your body fighting it. It's from your body trying to reject it, the coughing and the runny nose and all these things. So when you get the vaccine, your body doesn't know that, it's not the virus. Your immune system doesn't realize that it's just RNA and that it doesn't need to like fight it. So if you are getting sick after the second dose, that's because your body now has had the first dose and recognizes that the mRNA is something it doesn't want, and it's trying to fight it. Like it's making sure that you don't get sick. So the differences in side effects are just differences in immune responses, and our bodies are all super different, and that's why when you design clinical trials, you want a diverse population in terms of race, ethnicity, and age, and all these different factors that contribute to how our body responds. So if you're having a more severe immune response, it's not bad. It means that your body is responsive to the RNA. So I think it's pretty expected that you'll have fever-like symptoms or flu-like symptoms like a fever, headache, all those things that your body does in order to keep you safe from the viruses. So people who don't necessarily have people who don't necessarily get sick after the dose, it could just be their immune systems work differently, or they're not as sensitive, or not having as severe of a response to the virus.
Got it. And on that topic, I have to say, even when I was really sick for 2 days and just couldn't spend a lot of time on the couch underneath a blanket, I was like shivering with my fever and thinking to myself, this is so worth it to not get this nasty virus. So I hope everybody else feels the same way about their vaccine side effects if they do get them. Can we talk about this conspiracy theory that's going around that there's going to be a microchip in the vaccine or it's going to change your DNA in some way? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure where the microchip thing came from, but I think that, there's no microchip in the RNA. That would be a lot of work, honestly, to try and figure out how to get a microchip in
In a little tiny needle like that?
yeah. But I actually do kind of understand why people are under the impression it will change your DNA, because inherently it's the way that RNA and DNA works. And DNA actually is what transcribes RNA. So DNA is the blueprint for RNA, which is the blueprint for proteins. So I understand the misconception that if you're putting foreign RNA into your body, it might affect how your DNA, it might affect your DNA, but that's actually not the case. So because DNA is the blueprint for RNA, it doesn't work the other way around. Your RNA doesn't actually influence your DNA. So it's all your RNA is going to do, all the RNA is going to do is affect proteins. So it's going to only tell your cells about those spike proteins and then produce antibodies to change them. It's not actually going to change your DNA in any way that's harmful or could be concerning. The other thing that is a big misconception is about the fertility issues. And I also think that came from the hesitancy around pregnant women. And that, as we talked about earlier, the cautions about pregnant women stem from the fact that population just wasn't included in the clinical trial. And hopefully, as we get more information, and I showed earlier that there are clinical trials being done to show that it's safe in pregnant women, that will understand that it doesn't impact fertility and it is safe for both the mother and the child, and doesn't impact fertility down the road.
I think the most exciting thing about some of this early information that's coming out about pregnant women getting the vaccine is that they're passing the antibodies on to their babies. And it's going to be really exciting to find out more about that, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
I have two more questions for you, unless anybody else wants to chime in the chat. So this one is from Adriana. She would like to know, what would your message be to someone who is skeptical or hesitant to take the vaccine?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would say that what I said earlier is that there's been a lot of great work to make sure that it's safe. There's been a lot of people who have worked really hard to formulate these guidelines. There's been a lot of great work between the companies and the government to make sure it's safe, even if it's not fully approved yet. I think the government definitely wouldn't be allowing, the FDA wouldn't be allowing these vaccines to be happening on a mass scale if there were any doubts about its safety. I also think that when you are getting the vaccine, you're helping someone who is at, or if you are at risk, it's helping the community. It's helping the economy and helping us all sort of return to normal in ways that otherwise just won't happen. So I think that even besides the government, there was the really great point earlier about how do people get the virus, and all the work that's been done for the past year and a half on understanding the virus and the spike proteins. And I think that the scientific community as a whole has done a really great job to make sure that we can get back to normal and that we can kind of beat the virus as a whole.
Yeah, and last time we had this conversation, you and I, we were talking a lot about, some of the equity issues in testing and, just awareness and everything. And I think that there's some equity issues with, just in the medical community. I know that a lot of Black and Brown communities don't necessarily trust some of the research that's being done. And I'm hoping that, the more widely that this vaccine is available, the more people who get it, we can, hopefully try to talk to some of those communities who really, they have legitimate reasons for being hesitant, and help them understand why this is such a great thing for the community and for them too,
Yeah.
individually.
Yeah, and I think in terms of equity, one of the things is those populations can historically haven't been included in clinical trials, which has been like a major problem in the history of medicine. But with these vaccines in particular, a big effort has been made to make sure that it really will be safe for everyone. So including Black and Brown communities in the clinical trials was a major thing that these companies made sure that they did to ensure that the vaccine would be safe for everyone. And I hope, like you said, as more data comes out showing the vaccine safety, and as more people actually receive the vaccine, that we'll see that it is safe.
Great. Yeah. And then just one more question before we wrap up. We've covered a lot of information. I have not taken a science class since I was maybe in high school. So a lot of this is just a little bit over my head. So my question for you is, for among our attendees, if they remember one thing from your presentation, what do you hope that it is?
Yeah, I hope that they feel safer taking the vaccine. I hope they remember that the FDA set out guidelines to protect them, and that these clinical trials were done not with the intention of it wasn't purely fiscally motivated. There was a lot of work that's been done in terms of the pandemic as a whole in order to make sure that everyone is safe. So, and this vaccine was no exception to that.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I did see a couple of questions come in at the 11th hour, but I think we're about ready to wrap up. So I would just remind everybody to please contact the library if you do have questions. If we don't know the answer, we know who does, and we can help you find the answers to those questions and help you kind of navigate the next frontier of this vaccine hunt. So thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you to our attendees. Hope to see you at another program somewhat soon, and we will be posting information about this program on our social media pages. So thanks everyone, and good night.